Well, I hope so. Oh, yeah.
Oh, no. No, no. Yeah, I got some oranges. Come on, Brad.
Good morning, friends, and welcome to Grace St. Luke's Church. My name is Ollie Renscher, a member of the clergy staff, and I'm glad that you are here today. We have several people that are joining us here in person, and we thank you for those who are joining us online. Our guest today is a friend of mine, Dr. Jay Wellons, who's here from Nashville, and I'll, after a prayer, give an introduction and allow him an opportunity to speak with us about a book that will be released in June. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, in this season of Easter, we give you thanks and praise for the gift of life, for the gift of story, for our stories as pilgrims on the way, each of us bringing our story interwoven with your story of resurrection, of learning, of growth, and we are especially grateful for the work and ministry of Jay Wellons, the sharing of his story through a book that has been written and will be released soon. Be with us as we engage the conversation this day, mindful of the sacredness of life and all that we can learn from one another. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So Jay, a friend for many years, is a professor in the departments of neurological surgery, pediatrics, plastic surgery, radiology, and radiological sciences there at Vanderbilt, there at the hospital and at the University Medical Center. And I've known Jay for about 30 years. It's been about 30 years we have known one another. He has written a few op-eds for the New York Times. He lives in Nashville with his wife, Melissa, who's here with us today. His older child, Jack, is my godson, so I'm privileged to say that. And then their daughter, Fair. They are very active in the life of Christ Church Cathedral in Nashville, and it's a real pleasure to welcome him today. His book, All That Moves Us, a Pediatric Neurosurgeon, his young patients and their stories of grace and resilience. That is the title of his book, and it is a reflection on what he continues to learn from them, and so much about life, what we can learn from other people is a lot of what he will reflect on today. So please join me in welcoming Jay Wellons.
Thank you, Ollie. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be here in three dimensions. I feel like that I know this parish so well through the pandemic and through the wonderful online services that you all have been able to provide us. So I bring you greetings from Christ Church Cathedral in Nashville, and Dean Timothy Kimbrough, and Melissa and Matthew, and a wonderful group of priests that we also have at our church, a very rich and similar vibrant community to the one that you all have here. You know, I could probably speak for the entire 45 minutes about a 30-year friendship with Ollie. I can tell you that we've been up and down the sacramental chain from the beginning to end several times within our life, from baptism to...
You can speak up. You're hard to hear.
A little more sound. Can we bring it up closer?
Yeah, that would help.
How's that? Is that better?
Perfect.
Yeah, great.
Use your stadium voice.
Use the stadium voice. Well, I was thinking that, you know, everybody wants to hear about Ollie, so maybe that's why they want me to speak a little bit louder. Yeah. I was just mentioning that we've been from, you know, baptism through confirmation, through marriages and deaths, and back again multiple times over the course of our 3 decades friendship. And so I'm very grateful. It's a moment of gratitude, and I'm really proud to be here to see this wonderful, beautiful church that has grown under all of you all's tutelage and work. So thank you again for letting me be here. And I did want to also thank you for acknowledging Melissa. So another important person in my life of 30 years. So thank you for being here, Mel, and an extremely important person. But, you know, I think for those of you who were at the early service Laura's sermon really talks a lot about some of the things that we're facing in our life. And there are daunting challenges that we have in our time. And there are daunting challenges back in Jesus' time. And there are challenges that we all have over the course of our existence, no matter when we've existed. And it's not lost on me that, multiple times in the Bible, Jesus mentions children and the wisdom of children. I'll read from Mark 9. He took a little child that he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And when he welcomes me, does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." And, that's from obviously the Christian New Testament. Gandhi himself said, if you want to teach peace, teach it to the children and listen to the children. If you open up the Talmud, if you open up the Quran, if you look at meditations from Buddhist philosophers, there's a lot about the wisdom of children. So what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit of the wisdom that I've been able to glean in 20 years, which is just unbelievable to reflect back on it, of taking care of children. And to some extent their parents too, in terms of, when you meet a pediatric neurosurgeon, that is, let's say, not the highest point of your life typically. That's a time where there's great stress, where you're learning that your child has a diagnosis that brings a great deal of grief with it. And either that's from trauma, or from brain tumors, or from blood vessel malformations, or from spine fractures. And there are lots of other areas of medicine in which there are these significant events, but neurosurgery and pediatric neurosurgery seems to have a lot of them. And so over the course of this time, you walk a lot of journeys with these children, and you walk a lot of journeys alongside these patients. And so for me personally, when I began to kind of make this pivot into writing about this, it was at a part of my own journey. All of us have times in our lives where we all have some degree of an existential threat. And I myself went from warp 9, I like to say, to bed rest for 2.5 months, recovering from my own tumor that had to be taken out of my leg. It was benign and it was thought to be malignant initially, but in order for it to heal up the way that it should, I needed to stay still. And that was a little bit of a mantra, was how to stay still, which is not something when you're, and I'll say these things just for relevance, when you're division director of a growing pediatric neurosurgery division, when you're vice chairman of the department, when you're program director in charge of teaching all of the neurosurgery residents, when you're in charge of all the clinical research for all of the surgeons at Vanderbilt, in order to make sure that they can all be successful in the clinical outcomes in epidemiology and biostatistical work that they do. When you have to help understand how to do that analysis, all of a sudden, you're still. And in the early days of it, when you're thinking about the significance of what you may be looking at in the future, it does, as I said before, cause a bit of an existential threat. And I thought to myself, I have walked this path with so many of these children and so many of these parents for 20 years. Hundreds and hundreds of brain tumors I've taken out, hundreds and hundreds of emergency operations in the middle of the night, getting out of bed at 2 a.m., leaving Thanksgiving meals, leaving Christmas. Those are just part and parcel of what we did. How can I look back and see how these children and their parents have moved through this time of absolute grief to resolution on the other end? That's not to say that every single child lived. Pediatric brain tumors are a big issue. You guys have a wonderful institution here at St. Jude's. I'm proud to know the pediatric neurosurgeon. It's an amazing community. Oncologists, the work that they do there is phenomenal. And we work a lot hand in hand with the team at St. Jude's, led by their constant push to move forward, to push the treatment of children with pediatric brain tumors forward. And we do the same. And we think about what resilience and grace that these people have as they move through this. I remember a patient whose name is Hannah. And by the way, all these folks are okay with me talking about them. I've spoken to them. I've gotten consent. Many times when I've talked to parents about it, they've asked me to read the story that I've written to them so that we can share the moment again, grace renewed once again, and that's been a very moving thing for me to have the honor to be able to do. But I think of Hannah, who was a teenager, who came to see me with a large tumor in the middle of her brain that was causing a substantial tremor. And she had named that tumor Little Devil. That's the name of it. And she moved through her own treatment and surgery and recovery with a great deal of grace, and a great deal of fortitude and resilience. It wasn't perfect, but she made it. And she's back to a wonderful life now with her family and looking forward to the future. But the point is that I thought to myself, well, okay, if she can name her tumor, well, I can name my tumor. And I kind of liked the underworld motif. So I named mine Wormwood, after the character in C.S. Lewis, the Screwtape Letters, and thought about how what Hannah had gone through, multiple of these children that I've cared for have gone through, and how they've moved through to the other side. So my sister, Sarah, who's, as Ollie knows, and Melissa is a bit of an enabler, said, there's only so much Netflix you can watch when you're down for 2.5 months, Jay. Why don't you start writing some of these stories, because you're a bit of a storyteller. And as Ollie mentioned, I'm from Mississippi and grew up in the Episcopal Church in Mississippi, and so much of what we have in the South is about communal times, sitting around a fire, sitting around a table, telling stories. And so I said, I think I will. And so I ended up writing a humorous story that I just sent it to Melissa, my wife. It's funny that you live in the same house as somebody, you send them, I emailed it to my wife, who came back, emailed it back, said, this is pretty funny, this is good. So then I sent it to my enabling sister, Sarah. I say that in the best sense of the word. And lo and behold, before I know it, Sarah had sent this to a friend of hers who just stepped off the editorial board in the New York Times, who then took it and sent it to the people on the editorial board at the New York Times, who then gave her the message that you need to have him submit this to us this week. And so, to make a long story short, I submitted it, and it ran. And I couldn't believe that it ran, but it ran. And I remember sitting and refreshing the web browser over and over again until the story actually ran. Until the essay and the Sunday Review ran, and I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe this has happened. And the outpouring after that was, hey, this is a funny story. Like, you're a funny writer. You should do more of this, from colleagues across the country and friends who you kept up with. And the editor, a guy named Peter Capriano at the time, said, you're a pediatric neurosurgeon. I bet you got something serious. Why don't you, let me hear what you have to say. So this is the piece that I'm going to read about a patient, Jensen Jones, who had a phenomenal impact on me early on in my career, and how her impact on me impacted a lot of the care that I rendered and was able to set up in systems and rendering over the course of the ensuing 20 years. Okay. So the name of this piece is called 90 Minutes from You by Ground. On a blustery, rainy Saturday in my first year of practice, I went to my office after rounds, put my feet up on my desk, took a sip of lukewarm coffee, and leaned back in my chair to relax after a busy morning. Within seconds, I felt the pager clipped to my belt vibrate. I set my mug down on the desk and called the number back. An emergency room doctor from another hospital immediately picked up and identified himself. Doc, said a quick voice. We've got a 9-year-old girl who was a rear passenger in a 2-car collision about 2 hours ago. She's just arrived. The scan shows a 3-centimeter subdural hematoma on the right side of her brain. We're a small show. Can you take her? Yes, I said immediately. What's her exam? Her right pupil's blown and she's posturing on the left. The pupil typically dilates on the side of the brain with increased pressure, in this case the right side, as the brain is forced down and away from the blood clot. The nerve responsible for pupillary function basically goes haywire. It starts to enlarge in response. That term he used, posturing, describes a movement pattern that comes from damage being done to the part of the brain that deals with movement. Both are outward signs of high brain pressure. Put bluntly, this girl was sick, getting sicker quickly, and the window to save her was closing. Why don't you already have her in the air? I said, slightly annoyed. My hospital at the time was in Birmingham, Alabama. Theirs was in Auburn, 100 miles away. A medical helicopter could have her here in just over 30 minutes, well within the window to save her. Weather's too bad between Auburn and Birmingham to fly in. She's 90 minutes from you by ground, at least, he said, clearly knowing what that meant. An hour and a half in an ambulance, plus the 2 hours since her accident, is a long time to have high intracranial pressure and expect to survive. What do we do? He asked. Even now, when I'm faced with a situation without an obvious solution, my mind goes to my father and the calmness I felt flying next to him as a child. During his more than 4 decades of service in the Air National Guard, he piloted all types of planes in all types of situations and weather. Early on, he taught me to review the flight checklist before every takeoff and landing. Once aloft, we would practice emergencies in the air. As we would gain altitude and I would be focused on keeping the plane level on the horizon or interpreting the navigation system, he would quietly feather the props the tiniest amount or trim the flaps just so. Then, as we gently lost airspeed and the altimeter would slowly begin to wind down under his watchful eye, he would have me work the problem until I had it figured out. Flying and problem solving went hand in hand for him, and it was as much a part of him as breathing. As the memory faded, I found myself staring at the worn photo of my father that sat on my office desk. He's standing next to an F-4 Phantom, helmet under his arm, grinning widely in his olive drab National Guard flight suit. "Are those Black Hawk helicopters still stationed at that base near you?" I said to the emergency room doctor. "Yes, but," he trailed off. Then he was back. "Yes, those guys will fly in anything. You get the Black Hawks," I said. "I'll let our operating room know." My office at the time overlooked the street in front of the hospital. After half an hour, I looked down to see the surface of the coffee in my mug rippling like in the scene in Jurassic Park, where the approaching T-Rex's footsteps are detected in puddles of water. Within seconds, there were rhythmic pulsations all around, then a strong thump, 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 thump as the air beat against my window. Outside, in the midst of the downpour, trash cans tumbled down the street and pickup trucks were forced down on their shocks. I gazed up to see an Army Black Hawk helicopter, giant in comparison to our standard medical helicopters, hovering steadily over the Children's Hospital helipad. Rain and fog swirling in all directions. Every part of the office stumped, the heartbeat in my own chest now overpowered. Events moved quickly after the girl's arrival. In the pediatric trauma bay, 2 of the soldiers who brought her through the storm, still in their wet flight gear, worked alongside our nurses. As I came to the bedside, one of the nurses greeted me by name, and the younger of the 2 soldiers, for some inexplicable reason, immediately snapped to attention. A vision of my father in his flight suit flashed in my head. "At ease, soldier," I said. "I should be saluting you." As we packaged the child up and headed off to the elevator up to the operating room, I turned back to them. There they stood amidst the residual chaos of the trauma room, torn paper packaging and discarded blue gowns strewn about. They watched us roll into the elevator. I locked eyes with the closest soldier. He gave the briefest of nods just before the doors closed. Then he and the chaos of the trauma bay were gone. The OR team was ready for it. The sterile instruments laid out on the back tables, blue drapes applied after a quick clipping of her hair, and lightning-fast wash of her head with sterilizing prep solution. In life-saving operations like this, as the clock has ticked past 0, the typical precision of neurosurgery loses out to speed. Speed at all costs. Knife. No, damn it. We can stop the bleeding later. Retractor. Drill. Scissors to open the dura. The thin leathery covering of the brain, bulging in tight from the underlying blood. The liquid part of the clot jets out around the scissors as we cut. Once the brain is exposed, it does the work for us, extruding most of the solid coagulated clot out in a matter of seconds. We clean out what is left at the edges, and I see the offending vein torn away from the brain during the accident. We coagulate it and begin to make our way out, step by step, gently repairing all that we had to take apart to get there. After surgery, she immediately began to stabilize, waking up and even flickering her eyes open. But her recovery took time, and her journey was not without cost. She was left with a noticeable weakness on her left side and the slightest slur to her speech. But she was alive. With each follow-up appointment, some hurdle had been overcome. Over time, I would receive updates from her family. She would come to enter and then win a local beauty and talent pageant, be voted most school spirit, cheer alongside friends dressed up as the school mascot, and then, one remarkable May day, graduate from high school. 4 years later, she would finish college and head to graduate school for a career in social work. All of this chronicled first in clinic visits, then as the medical reasons to see me faded, and holiday cards and the occasional letter. A decade and a half after her injury, I received one such letter. No longer the hand-drawn cards of childhood or newspaper clippings from her proud parents. This was a handwritten note on elegant stationery inviting me to her wedding. Her wedding. I could still see her in the bed of the pediatric ICU after surgery, a 9-year-old child with abrasions on the side of her face from the accident and a clean white head wrap around her head. The nurses methodically connecting her to the monitors, line by line, tube by tube. Me urging her to squeeze my hand for a sign, any sign that she was better. Now, years later, I was reading how thankful she was to have been given this chance, grateful for those soldiers in that helicopter, for the 2 hospital teams, and for me. She promised to always have us in mind as she began her new married life, and hopefully one day raise her own family. As I read the letter, sitting in a different office in a different city, thinking back over those events, I found myself realizing how deeply grateful I was for her evolving story over the years. All the cards, each barrier broken, every milestone, and for what the experience taught me. So many other critically ill children in the subsequent years benefited from this early experience when I was learning how hard to push, where to draw the line, and how much to expect of others. My father's lessons in the air, that industrious emergency room doctor, those brave soldiers soaked to the bone, standing there as we rolled away. So many people and events came together for this one child to grow into her life, to find happiness, to find love. All of us need a living, breathing reminder to just keep pushing on. There may be a life there to be beautifully and fully lived. A person who just needs someone, anyone, to work the problem, to make the hard call, and to fly in a storm. So, I will take the applause because I didn't actively cry when I read that story. I'm still not going to work through this. But neurosurgery is full of stories. It is full of stories. And if you go into the cafeteria of a children's hospital or an adult hospital, there is a great deal of prayer and gratitude and asking for healing that is occurring every single solitary day. And as I mentioned before, this concept of how do we take these experiences from these children, these experiences that we've lived with them, and turn them into something that not only ourselves, but others can read and perhaps glean from and understand that, just like Laura was saying today in her sermon, for those of you who hadn't heard, it's a wonderful sermon, about how on the other end of this unknown, on the other end of this daunting, there is hope. And I see a lot of hope in this. And one of the things that happened after the first story came out was that, hey, you're a funny writer. After this one came out, my email it's public. I can't, hundreds, 300, 400 emails from people around the world saying, thank you for this. We really got a great deal of hope for this. This was around the time that the pandemic was beginning to kind of raise its head over in China and Italy, and later on I would say it would soon roll across the coasts, like some advancing army as it made its way into our own society here. But there was a great deal of fear then, and I think a lot of us have lived a significant amount of time in an unknown period. What will tomorrow bring? What would next week bring? And I will tell you that when I had the great kind of honor of reading the stories about people who had gotten something from Jensen's story, is when I realized that I thought, my goodness, there's so many children that I've had the opportunity to work with. I think it's really important that we begin to tell those stories. So, my goal for this book as a neurosurgeon, always in the introduction, when I was in medical school, people are like, neurosurgeons are egotistical. Neurosurgeons, they're mean. So my chairman makes fun of me when I say they're mean. But the reality of it is that we walk these journeys with our patients, and it's a great deal that we have to learn from them. And it's important that these stories are told. And I think during COVID, all of us have kind of begun to see that we have gotten to the other side, and maybe there's a larger lesson for us to learn here, as daunting and as frightening as that was. And there, sad times. All of us have lost people in COVID. All of us have lost coworkers in COVID. And I remember the very day that we got, immunized as being, like a substantial day. I remember, people were tears. They were so happy to have that opportunity, and how that kind of rolled out across our society and how it's rolled out since then. But there still has been some division that's come from that. I like to think in its ideal way, the church itself, you could say, well, when the church, when we had to go virtual, it limited the amount of times that you could come to church, and it limited our ability to interact with one another, and that's true. But I also think about what it really showed me in the ability to come to this church, and I just feel like I've been a part of your church. I've prayed for the people that have died in your church. I feel like I read about what the men's group's doing, and I remember, is it Meredith? Was that the other thing? She gave a Maundy Thursday a meditation about how we couldn't wash each other's feet, but how we could wash our hands, and how important that was early in the pandemic. And as a surgeon, I wash my hands like 4 times a day to go to the operating room. And every time I wash my hands to go out to scrub to operate, I think of that meditation, and it calms me. That's a wonderful gift that you all have given to me. So I think about how really, as opposed to it being limiting, maybe what we should see is that it's caused us to understand how much we are all alike. Certainly as a lifelong Episcopalian, I look into I'm like, hey, what are we singing today? All right, I love this one, and what is the prayer? Oh, this is a new prayer. That's a great Mother's Day prayer, So there is some of the lifelong Episcopalian in me. But also I think of it a little bit like a tapestry that's been woven among each other. And we realize that we can have effects not just on ourselves and on our own Sunday schools, but in those who we interact with on a broader basis. And so, honest to goodness, really the reason to write this book was to try to help really provide a tapestry and let these children's stories kind of help all of us, cover us all, and give us all a sense of grace and resilience and hope. So that's really what I wanted to say today, and I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk to you all and to be here with my friend Ollie. And thank you for making the journey with me, Melissa, and Ellie. Thank you for putting up with this last night, and thank you all for having me here. So I could read and read and read and read, but I know probably it's a good time for discussions, because this is kind of a discussion forum, and I just welcome anybody who has their own stories to tell or any other questions to ask. I'd love to take those.
Questions of any sort?
Sorry.
Like Donnie.
This is kind of a strange question, but I was curious. I'm really glad you connected with Grace St. Luke's and Ollie during the pandemic, because I personally found a whole new ability to join in the services that, as a long-time Episcopalian did. Oh yeah, hey, what's happening?
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
I remember like the one of the priests at the Canterbury would do a morning prayer and evening prayer service from the garden with the animals around him, and my kids loved that. That's the one they would choose. I'm sorry, Ollie, but they would choose that one. As they loved that. So yeah.
Yeah, but I think we brought in I sent the links to my cousins who are not Episcopalian, but didn't have the opportunity to experience an online worship where they were, Catholics and other. So I think Ollie, who's incredible in that regard, brought in a national audience, maybe an international audience, to experience what we get, luckily, in person. But I guess the real question was Christ Church without an online presentation?
No, we did. We had it. Timothy's wonderfully media savvy, and
yeah, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Oh no! I don't feel on the spot at all. Honest to goodness, I think to some extent I just use it as an opportunity to roam, just kind of roam what our church has to offer. And I could talk about this a lot, but there's a lot that we do well in the Episcopal Church. There's a lot that our evangelical colleagues do. I would argue, if you go to an evangelical gathering and you boil it down to the very deepest part of it, it's the church is a safe space and God loves me. The church is a safe space and God loves me, right? And, that's a pretty good mantra, right? You can tap all kinds of stuff on it. But the reality of it is that, we have this path that we feel is how we practice our theological construct. But other people have a lot to give us. The words of Gandhi, the words from the Quran, the words from a lot of Buddhist meditations that you look at, Thich Nhat Hanh, who did a lot of work with Buddhism and Christianity. And I think that we are fortunate because this has shown us that we can weave this tapestry of our own theological construct for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just gave us an opportunity to experience how other people do it instead of you just becoming insular in your own particular parish.
Yeah.
This is the way it's supposed to be done.
Is it Eucharistic prayer A today or B? I feel a little crazy. Let's do C.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I just had a question from the beginning of your practice, over the 20 plus years. Like, how is as you journey with families that are in crisis, moments of, for them, probably the hardest time in their lives, like, how's your sort of approaches, if any changes or things you've learned? Just curious.
Yeah, no, I actually had a hard time figuring out which story to tell. Oh my gosh, this sounds like I'm hawking the book. I don't mean that, but like there's a story in here of a child named Allie, and Allie had a giant brainstem cavernoma, huge, it's the biggest thing I've ever saw. And she basically presented herniated, which meant her pupils worked and that was it. And when you have to go in and have, the title of that's called Conversations, when you have to have this conversation that no parent wants, you have to in some way, I think of it like a clutch, for folks, and everybody in this room, has driven a car, a manual car, and those things are going away, but everybody remembers the clutch. And to some extent, I have to disengage myself from the parent part of who I am. Melissa and I have been blessed with 2 wonderful children. But as you have to disengage to some extent to be able to say, I know that, and I think I'll write some words similar to this, like, I know that what I'm about to tell you, you don't want to hear. I don't want to have to tell it, but it's my job to tell it to you. You know this child, you've loved this child since the day they were born, and you need to be informed about this child. And so I think the way that I've progressed in my practice of 20 years is just really acknowledging people's humanity. As we get older, we are not immune to suffering. It doesn't matter if we're good people or bad people, or right people or wrong people, or black people or white people, or brown people, or whoever we are not immune to suffering. And I think as you have experiences in your life where your parents die, or you have an issue having children, or you have a tumor in your leg, you begin to see yourself as a real person who's lived not a terrible life. And you say, if this type of suffering can happen to me and happen to my loved ones and happen to people around me and happen to these wonderful people who are living these lives and these things happen, I think you just have to acknowledge that. And I think early on in my practice, as you're a resident in training, it's an 80-hour work week, which meant before that, there was no hour restrictions, which meant, I think I would see Melissa when I was at Duke for literally like 6 hours a week for about 6 years. And so then they tamped down work hours to 80 hours. So you come out of your residency just shot like a gun, like, here's a patient, here's a problem, here's a solution, get the consent, go to the OR, done. Here's a patient, here's a problem, here's an image, here's consent, go to the OR, done. And you cannot help but over 20 years, over 10 years, over 2 years, as you begin to walk these journeys with these families, as I've said multiple times, walk the journeys. It's really what it's like, and recognize their humanity. And so I have this thing that happens to me, and this, I haven't gotten the right word for it yet, but somehow I can feel all this goodness and grace at the end of this, at the resolution of this, where it somehow travels back through time and space. I know that sounds crazy. Melissa always makes fun of me when I say time and space. Time and space. When it travels back and it just infuses this moment with this goodness and grace that allows me to say, this are the things that you need to know. This is the conversation that we have to have. We will move through this together, and we will be on the other side of this one way or the other. Does that make sense?
We have another question right here. Sure.
Thank you for coming and being with us this morning, and for sharing. I would be curious to know, as you were roaming and finding other parishes virtually during that period, and I'm sure that you were drawn here because of Ollie and your relationship, and you mentioned Meredith, but could you share anything else about what had you land here and recognize this particular place as special virtually?
Oh,
I
that's
think
a
that's
wonderful
going to be
question.
a part going forward.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that my relationship with Ollie, really, I mean, to some extent, my kids wanted to see Jax wanted to see his godfather give a sermon, and the music here was beautiful, and the early on experience with Meredith's, beautiful hand washing from Monday, Thursday. I mean, every time I scrub to go to the OR. And then Laura's sermons are wonderful, and Ollie's sermons, this is my friend of 30 years, that all of a sudden the Holy Spirit's just like coming out of his mouth. So I think for me, you get a sense of the two-dimensionality of the church, and to some extent it fills itself out with the breadth of the church as you experience it. But I love to go into the Canterbury Cathedral, and seeing the priests sit out with the animals and the pigs rooting and doing a meditation. And I enjoyed visiting my friend Alston, who's a priest in Shreveport, who has a slightly different theology. I think, for me, it was really this opportunity to kind of broaden that spiritual construct. That is what really made me overcome I'm not sitting in church. I'm supposed to be sitting in church in a pew, listening, and okay, at this point we should be doing a second reading, Instead of that, I tried to recreate it at our home, right? The pandemic, I put 4 chairs out, and I put some hymnals out, and I put the common prayer book, and I made the kids come down, and the dog was supposed to curl up in our lap, and we were supposed to stand up and sing a hymn, and then within about a month, the kids have their feet up on the couch, and the dog is licking, and I'm like, come on, I'm sitting there like, come on, guys. So you really realize that it's just because what I want for my theology is not necessarily what it needs to be for Melissa, what it needs to be for my son Jack, who just embraced at our cathedral. We do a confirmation a little bit older, and I'm just not like that at all. And then I realized, oh my goodness gracious, he's 16 and he has his own theological construct. It's remarkable, right? Just to brag about him for just a moment, like he is playing in an ultimate frisbee tournament this weekend in the state championship as one of the players on the team. Jack's a good player. He's not a great player, but the boy is Orthodox Jewish, and he can't, because of their constraints of their religion, he can't interact with technology. And so Jack picked him up. He put the seatbelt. He clicked his seatbelt in for him. He texted the guy's dad that I've got him. He took care of all of that. And I'm saying that as an example, like, well, I like that spiritual construct so far. That's a good one. And that's his. That's not from me lining up the chairs and putting hymnals and books of common prayer in it. But I kind of think that's what we're supposed to be doing.
I was curious from the pediatric neurological aspect, the outcome may not be quite as cut and dry for some of these children.
Yep.
It might be a little murky and cloudy. Do you pair these families with a social worker,
Yes.
with a support group?
Yes.
And how does that work? I mean, is that immediate, or is that on the parents' perhaps own timeline?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of it also depends on what type of, just to get all clinical, I'm going to go left brain now. I've been embracing the right brain recently, but left brain, it depends. Is this a child who's had a benign tumor that's going to recover and not need any further therapy? Because in that case, they need physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. They need sunshine school. They need what allows them to move back into their lives, and as much as a traumatic event is. Or is this a malignant tumor? Is this a malignant tumor that's possibly treated with chemotherapy or radiation therapy? Because there's a whole different need for that. Or is this a grade 4 brain tumor that this child is going to die of in the next year and a half? And what your responsibility is to kind of help them gently move into that space where they pass away, and to help the parents in that transition as well. And We have, lots of children's hospitals. Lots of hospitals have an incredible palliative care team. We're fortunate to have one at our hospital. I know there's a terrific one here. I know there was a terrific one where we spent 10 years at UAB. That's a very important role, and it's a very important role for the children who hurt and want to hurt no longer. But it's also important for the parents, so that when they are 5 and 10 and 6 and 11 years out, they can look back on that time and say, we did what we could to comfort our child in this time for them. So yeah, there's a lot of support for children, and it's very important. If it was just relied on us neurosurgeons to do it, it would not be done well. I mean, we're good at operating and good at walking the journeys, but it is about a huge team that helps take care of these children.
Well, having known a few neurologists in my recent life, I think you're exceptional. They're not always driven and intentional. My experience has been indifference. Here's the diagnosis, good luck, and they uncouple immediately. It's like they're trying to run from it. So good job.
Well,
you're doing God's work.
Thank you. I'm honored by your words. Thank you.
You can take one more question.
So I was just wondering about your own personal faith in times when you are waiting for an outcome. In the medical field, you're going objectively, vitals, posturing, reducing, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Have you been in a situation where you really can't predict how this is going to go? It can go either way. And I'm interested in how you use your faith at that time to walk that journey with the patient and their families.
No, that's a wonderful question.
Speak up.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think probably the best way to say it is that I have this idea in my head about how there's kind of this hard driving bus driver. And that hard driving bus driver, he's like, ticket, come on, let's go. We got to get to the bus, got to get to the next stop. Let's go. And because you got to get people to the operating room, and you got to get everybody relegated and marching in the same direction. And the typing screen didn't get sent. How could we not get the typing screen sent? I know we have to have blood to go to the OR, but we got to move. So there's this part of you that has to just hit the floorboards and move it forward. And then there is this time, and I think all of us have had this in our life at some point, where that person has to step up and sit aside, and we have to let grace drive the bus. And grace has to drive the bus. There are times when grace just has to drive the bus. And so, for me, I do feel this kind of moment when, when my own mother was dying. I can remember this moment where it became time to stop being doctor's son. And I looked down and saw the Book of Common Prayer. And I said, it's time to let grace drive this bus. So that's how I would say the answer to that.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you all for letting me be here. I have to say that part of my own journey is to say I've been mentored by wonderful surgeons, and I've been mentored by wonderful writers. And this book comes out later. These books are amazing. And I just wanted to pitch these two books. One, Bomb Shelter by Mary Laura Philpott. She's a wonderful writer. She had a child diagnosed with seizures in the middle of the night, and she talks about what it's like to be a parent and go through this. So to some extent, she and I laugh and say that our books are book buddies, because one's from one perspective and one's from the other. And then this is by Toulouse Schaller Quinn, who was the head of Second Harvest in Nashville. She died of a malignant brain tumor, and it's her meditations as she moved on in this life, and it is a phenomenally powerful book. So I recommend both of these to you all if you are a book reader type. Oh yeah, right, yeah. So, and I saw some hands going to chest. So she's a wonderful Nashville writer. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Jay.
Okay, thank you all. Appreciate it.
And thank you, friends, for being here. And for those of you joining us online, we hope you will continue to do so. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.